Hello, these are Unit 3.2 flipped notes in our unit on development. In this section, we're talking about physical development across the lifespan. So all the way from prenatal stages, all the way into adolescence, adulthood. Let's go. So it all starts at conception. That's when the male sperm fertilizes the female's egg. Once that happens, the egg blocks all the other sperm. Women are born with all the eggs that they're ever going to have. Only about 1 in 5,000 of those eggs will actually mature. Men, however, begin producing sperm at puberty and then keep on producing sperm 24/7 for the rest of their life. They continue that ability to be a father. The first stage of prenatal development we call the germinal stage, and it's only the first 2 weeks. And at this point, most women don't even really know they're pregnant. At this point, you were once a zygote, a teeny tiny fertilized egg with up to 100 cells that were becoming increasingly diverse day by day. But of all the zygotes that are created in the world, only about half of those survive the first 2 weeks. One of the other big accomplishments or tasks that happens during the germinal stage is the formation of a placenta. One of the first symptoms that women feel during a pregnancy is that they're very tired. And one of the reasons for that is they're growing a new organ, the placenta, which is a band of lots and lots of cells that line the inside of the uterus. And the job of the placenta, it serves kind of as a filter or a barrier. It helps to provide nutrients, allows oxygen, all kinds of stuff to nutrition to pass from the mom to the baby, but then also allows waste to exit from the baby. So that growing of the placenta happens during the germinal stage. Our next stage is the embryonic stage from 2 weeks to 2 months. So after being a zygote, you have transitioned to being an embryo. An important stage at this point, your vital organs and systems are starting to form. However, when that doesn't go well, the body's response, if there's some kind of flaw in an organ, is often a miscarriage, that it just kind of stops development right there. So most miscarriages happen within less than the first 3 months. So it is traditional that a lot of people will not announce a pregnancy until after they've reached that 3-month mark because the chance of miscarriages goes way down. By 4 weeks, the embryo already has a basic or rudimentary heart, brain, but they can be recognized. By 8 weeks, you were about an inch long. You had arms and legs and a face. Didn't really look maybe what you envision a face to look like, but you had one. So fertilization there is a zygote, 4 weeks, a very small embryo, and then by 8 weeks, starting to look a little alien-like human there. And then our next stage, the longest, is the fetal stage from 8 weeks to birth. During that stage, the baby's known as a fetus. Right around 4 months, that's when mom can start feeling the baby moving around inside there. Around 6 months, they have a well-developed grasp, taste buds. Some other things, around 12 weeks are when sex organs start to differentiate. Fingers and toes by 16 weeks, hearing at 20 weeks, 24 weeks, which seems relatively late. That's 6 months, is when the lungs begin to develop. Brain starts to really grow rapidly around 28 weeks. And then, really, those last few months are about the baby kind of growing in weight, muscle strength, their bones getting fully developed. Once the child has reached about 24 weeks, they've reached what's known as the age of viability. That's the youngest age of which a baby could survive a premature birth. However, not without delays and complications. At about 24 weeks, less than 50%, right around 50% of babies or about 50% of preemie babies can survive at that age. And one of the biggest problems at that age is that the lungs are just barely developing at that young age. After the age of viability, babies continue to grow. By about 38 weeks, they've usually reached about full term weight, which is around 7 pounds and is about 20 inches in length. My daughter is Gwendolyn, and she was a preemie. She was born 10 weeks early, 2 pounds, 15 ounces. So definitely past that age of viability, but early enough to scare us. And I've got a pretty interesting birth story, so I'll share that with you guys in class. Some other prenatal influences. This one happens during that germinal stage. and it's Down syndrome. It's a genetic abnormality where the zygote receives an extra chromosome right at the moment of conception. Down syndrome is characterized as an intellectual disability. Often it correlates with the age of the mother when she gives birth, that women over 35, their risks of Down syndrome in their child go way up, and pregnancies at that age are actually called geriatric pregnancies. Down syndrome is characterized by unique facial features. You can see some of that in the pictures there, and then all kinds of other health problems related to heart, vision, hearing, and more. Again, we mentioned this in the last section, teratogens play a big role from the environment in affecting the baby before it's even born. But we were kind of emphasizing more on drugs and alcohol, but other things like chemicals, like house cleaners, radiation from x-rays, viruses, those can all affect development of the baby. For example, rubella, which is German measles, can cause blindness, deafness, even stillbirth. Syphilis can cause all kinds of problems and a miscarriage for the mother, and then AIDS can be passed on to the child prior to birth as well. More on teratogens, just because don't want you to do any of this stuff. Illegal drugs like cocaine can result in the baby being born addicted to the drug. Even some legal drugs like medications, the baby can become addicted to those. So pretty much any medication, if you look at the box, it says, if pregnant, ask your doctor. Fetal alcohol syndrome, even in like the milder cases, it may not cause all those facial differences, but it can cause problems with attention span, learning, coordination, and behavior. Smoking by the mother during pregnancy can cause basically the mother gets fewer nutrients, which causes the baby to have a lower birth weight, and really heavy smoking can affect the brain as well. Some newborns' reflexes, once the baby's born, they have quite a few unlearned involuntary responses. They usually go away within just a few months, and they're replaced with learned behaviors. The rooting reflex, and we'll watch a video in class to demonstrate these, but with the rooting reflex, if you touch an infant's cheek, they'll turn their head towards it, and that's to prepare them for nursing. The sucking reflex to help them nurse, to breastfeed. The startle or the Moro reflex, when they're scared, they'll shoot their arms and legs out even when they're asleep. The Babinski reflex, if you tickle the bottom of their foot, they'll push into it and flare their toes out. And then the grasping reflex. Infants right at birth have a really, really strong grasp. You could even kind of lift them up by it. You shouldn't, but you could. Some other things established very early on that you may not have thought of, but research shows that infant temperament, or kind of the foundation of your personality, is established within just the first 2 to 3 months of age. So in this longitudinal study over temperament, which is your characteristic mood, your activity level, how you react emotionally, they found that it was established very early on, and they identified 3 basic temperamental styles among babies. There were easy babies, a majority of them, 40%, who were happy, they slept well, they ate well, they adapted, they just didn't get upset very easily. Slow to warm up or withdrawn babies, 15%, less cheery, less regular, but overall they were okay. And then difficult babies, like this angry one in the picture, I love that one. About 10% were glum, erratic in sleep and eating, very resistant to change, and just relatively kind of irritable babies. And then there were quite a few who were mixed, or they weren't able to identify really what their temperament was. But what they found in this longitudinal study was that when they looked at these kids later on and all the way into adulthood, that their infant temperament was a reflection of their overall personality into adulthood. So kind of interesting that, you know, where you are at 2 to 3 months of age, which pretty much all you do at that age is eat, sleep, and poop, really influences your personality. Let those babies sleep. Maturation is a key word from this section. And maturation is the idea that our brain creates a genetic sequence for how we will develop physically. So, for example, we have to learn to stand before we walk, we babble before we talk. So, maturation sets the basic course of development. Experience can influence it some, but you have to go in that sequence because that's how your brain has designed your body. The control of motor development in the body parts reflects that maturation.
The cephalocaudal trend, cepha means head, says that infants are going to learn to gain control of their head before they are able to control towards their feet. So they're able to lift their heads, kind of gain muscle strength. If you know about babies and tummy time, that's the goal of that, is to try to gain strength in their head there before they're going to learn to be able to control their feet and start walking. Proximo-distal trend, proximo has to do with the center, distal is to the side, so that they can control their center, like their torso, before they can control their arms and their legs. So before a baby can start crawling, first they have to roll over, which is a pretty big milestone and accomplishment. We'll watch some videos of that in class. Some other major milestones: sitting up unsupported, crawling, walking. Probably the main one you want to remember here is that walking usually starts right around 12 months, and that's an average. So it could be anywhere from like 9 to 14 months. If you recall from language, right around 1 year old is also when first words happen. So walking and talking right around 1 year old. And then finally, do babies have depth perception? The visual cliff experiment, another famous one in psych, asked that. So in this, the researchers created this contraption they called the visual cliff, where babies could crawl across this checkerboard pattern, and then they would get to a drop off. But it wasn't a true drop off. There was glass that went across there. So they wanted to see, would babies crawl over the visual cliff? What they found was that the older infants would not crawl over the deep side, that once they got there, they kind of stopped. Whereas the younger infants who were just barely learning how to crawl, they would go over the cliff. But what they found was once those younger kids got over the cliff and they were on that glass looking down, their heart rate went up. There were physiological changes indicating that they could detect that there was a drop off, but they just hadn't had the experience of crawling around the house, of coming across steps, and realizing what happens when you get to that depth. So yes, babies have depth perception, but their understanding of what to do with that depth modifies with age and experience. So the rest of this section, we're going to look at adolescence and growing older. Adolescence begins when puberty starts, are also called sexual maturation. Puberty actually starts a little bit earlier in girls, right around 11 years old. And then the males start their puberty a couple years later. The guys have their growth spurt a little bit later, so the girls end up getting a little bit taller at first. But then the boys' growth spurts usually last longer, and then they end up passing most girls in height. During puberty, both primary and secondary sexual characteristics develop. When we say primary, we're talking about the reproductive organs. And secondary sexual characteristics are the non-reproductive traits, like their voices deepening, facial and body hair, breasts, hips, all those things, other than the stuff that's actually needed for sexual reproduction. What about memory? Does it really decline with old age? Not necessarily. A lot of the studies show it has more to do with neural processing. So it just takes you longer to retrieve memories. Most memory loss tends to be episodic, so just like personal memories, but when it comes to like skills and general knowledge, people tend to remember those things. Some memory loss could be due to specific things like Alzheimer's disease, and we're going to actually talk more about the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in class. This graph showing how with time, our world knowledge, just general everyday knowledge, continues to grow throughout the lifespan, but it's all that processing, being able to think quickly, coming up with new ideas, that stuff starts to decline with age. Some of our sensory abilities do decline with age, including vision, your ability to identify correct smells. That's why a lot of older people think food doesn't taste the same, and it has to do with their sense of smell diminishing. And neural processing slows down.